All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of the Interpreter Roundtable Scripture discussion. Today we are on Lesson 20, which and the first chapter of 1 Samuel. I am Stephen Smoot, your moderator for this session today, and joining me today is John Gee and Craig Foster, who will, I'm sure, have wonderful insights for us on the Book of Ruth and the Book of 1 Samuel. And we will try to both summarize this for you to give you an idea of what the stories are about and then offer some insights. And so we'll start with the Book of Ruth here. Just to give a brief overview for those who may not be too familiar with the Book of Ruth or who may not have read it for a little while. It's nestled, well, in our Old Testament, it's nestled right in between the Book of Judges and the Book of 1 Samuel, if I'm not mistaken. Whereas in the Hebrew Tanakh and the Jewish Tanakh, it's actually located elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, in the beginning of what are called the Megalot, or the Five Scrolls, right next to the Song of Solomon, and some other texts there, such as Lamentations. But what's interesting about the Book of Ruth is it serves as sort of this transitory text, you might say, or a buffer text between Judges and 1 Samuel, because Ruth begins in the reign of the Judges. We find that in Ruth chapter 1, and it ends with the genealogy of King David, who we are then introduced to later in the Book of Samuel. And so we have this nice little text that transitions us into the story of David and the Davidic kingdom. What we have going on here in the Book of Ruth is, in some ways, a very sweet love story, you might say. We have Ruth, who's a widow who needs to be redeemed, or needs to raise up children for her husband, who died before he had a chance to have any children. And so Ruth is given over to a kinsman of Naomi, her mother-in-law, whose name is Boaz. And it talks about how she met Boaz, how they came together, how they married each other, but only after, interestingly enough, only after Boaz wanted to send Ruth off to another redeemer, it says in the text. We don't get his name, actually. He's just called Ploni Almoni, which means Mr. So-and-so. She sent over to him to maybe have him marry her to fulfill the levirate vow, or the levirate obligation, which John Gee will talk about. However, he doesn't do that, so Boaz ends up fulfilling the obligation of the levirate, and he marries Ruth and has children by her, and we get to the genealogy at the end of the Book of Ruth, beginning in verse 18. So that's a very brief overview of the Book of Ruth. You may remember the Book of Ruth for such memorable lines. For example, in chapter 1, you have both Ruth and her sister-in-law, Orpah, who go to Naomi, and both of their husbands have died, and they're about to leave and go back to Moab. And Orpah, of course, leaves, but here's what Ruth says. Ruth replied to Naomi, "Do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried." So a very touching moment between Ruth and Naomi. And then later in verse 3, I think another touching passage in this text. In verse 3, you have Ruth go to Boaz, and it talks about the fact that when she went to him, she basically proposes to him and wants to marry him. And I'm trying to find the verse here specifically where it says, yeah, here we go. Naomi says this. "Who are you?" he asked, meaning Boaz. And she replied, "I am your handmaid Ruth. Spread your robe over your handmaid, for you are a redeeming kinsman." In other words, put your cloak over me so that we can become married. And it's both an interesting passage, and I think it's kind of touching, this affection that Ruth has for Boaz. And we later see that relationship develop. So there's a brief general outline of the Book of Ruth for those who may not be too familiar with it. It's a very short book, just 4 chapters, so by all means, you should go back and reread it. You could probably do it in about a half hour or so. But now let's turn to some discussion about the significance of this text. And let's first turn to Craig Foster, who's going to give us some insights into Ruth's name and Naomi's name, if I'm not mistaken. He has some thoughts for us on that.
All right. As I read through Ruth and read the story, I thought popped into my head, what does the name Ruth mean? Is there possibly some symbolism there, and perhaps I'm reading more into it than there really was intended. But I looked up what the name Ruth means. It's from the Hebrew word root. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. R-E'-U-T, meaning friend. And so I think that's really, to me, it was significant that that Ruth's name would have that meaning, because if ever there was a friend to her mother-in-law, that was Ruth. And so I couldn't help but wonder if there was some symbolism there with her name being Ruth. Naomi is from the Hebrew word Naomi, which means pleasantness. And in Ruth chapter 1, verse 20, Naomi says that her name is no longer Naomi, that she wanted to be called Mara, for God had dealt her bitterness, and Mara means in Hebrew bitter. So I found that in terms of the names that are used in this book, there's a lot of symbolism there. I looked up Boaz out of curiosity, and that meant in Hebrew swift or swiftness. That didn't jump out at me as much in terms of symbolism for the overall story as the other names did, but I thought I would throw that in there. So as we read this, I personally, we know from scriptures that certain individuals are given names for a specific reason, for to give a message of some type, or to symbolize a characteristic. So that's why, to me, it really kind of jumped out that way with the names of Ruth and Naomi.
Excellent. Thank you for those insights. Certainly, understanding names of individuals can at times give us insights into this account and who these people are. And Craig, you're absolutely right that names can at times carry very great significance, convey the characteristics of these individuals we're reading of, and give us some insights into who they are. So those are excellent comments. Thank you for your insights. So with this in mind now, we have to remember that one of the big Book of Ruth is levirate marriage. This is discussed elsewhere in the Bible. The Law of Moses has laws telling you how you should conduct levirate marriage and what its significance is, and we see it actually happening in the Book of Ruth. And so we'll go now to John Yee, who can hopefully give us some insight and some clarification as to what levirate marriage is and what its function is here in the text of Ruth.
Well, this is an actually fairly old institution. You might remember it pops up in the Book of Genesis, because Judah's children are institute levirate marriage, and there's some tension there when they do. The basic scripture on it is Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10. If brethren dwell together, and one of them die and have no child, the wife of the dead shall not marry without unto a stranger. So I'm going to stop there quoting it and point out that the purpose behind this is to, once a woman marries into the family is in charge of taking care of her. And even if her husband dies, they just don't dump her out into the street. They're supposed to take care of her. So then it continues, her husband's brother shall go in unto her, and shall take her to him to wife, and perform the duty of an husband's brother unto her. And it shall be that the firstborn which she beareth shall succeed in the name of his brother which is dead, that his name be not put out of Israel. And the man liked not to take his brother's wife. Then his brother's wife go up to the gate unto the elders, and say, My husband's brother refuseth to raise up unto his brother a name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of my husband's brother. Then the elders of Israel shall call him and speak unto him, and say, and if he stand to it, and say, I like not to take her, then shall his brother's wife come up to him in the presence of the elders, and loose his shoe from off his foot, and spit in his face, and shall answer and say, So shall it be done unto that man that will not build up his brother's house. And his name shall be called in Israel, the house of him that hath his shoe loosed. Now, this plays into the story of Ruth, because in the story, Ruth ends up marrying Boaz, but there is somebody who's closer, and so has the right of first refusal, and he refuses him, and so they enact this passage in the Book of Ruth, and so that's part of the story with Ruth, and so that's this legal foundation is the basis for the story, and then the way it plays out in this legal thing in this particular story fits in very well with that, and it has to be kept in the background of what this legal institution is that they're trying to follow, and the whole point. So the point of the passage is that if a woman marries into a family, and I think you've got to think of it as marrying into a family, the family is supposed to take care of her. And so in the first chapter of Ruth, Orpah doesn't, Naomi says, well, we don't have any family left. We don't have any men to take care of us. Go back to your homes. And Ruth doesn't do that, and she ends up taking care of Naomi rather than the other way around. And this is all in this background here. Something else that's interesting in the first chapter of Ruth, when she's offered the chance to go, Naomi tells her in verse 15, Thy sister-in-law is gone back unto her people and unto her gods, return thereafter, thy sister-in-law. And then Ruth says, Entreat me not to leave thee or to return from following after thee, for whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. So there's a conversion that's taking place here. Where thou diest, I will die, and there will I be buried. And the Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me. And this, the Lord do so to me, implies a gesture. Now, I don't really know what the gesture is, but it's something like the Lord do so to me, or something similar. Some sort of gesture describing the punishment that God would do, that Ruth says God should do to her if she ever abandons her mother-in-law. So that, and that doesn't particularly translate well, because they don't really describe the gesture. And when they wrote the story, everybody knew what she was doing. We've kind of lost that in the meantime.
Thank you for those insights. That was an excellent explanation of levirate marriage and its significance. And as you said and as I said earlier, we have to understand that this is what's going on here in the story. So to understand levirate marriage is absolutely crucial. And that comment you had about the oath or the gesture at the very end is also very interesting. I can think of a location in Genesis with Abraham. I can't recall off the top of my head which chapter it is, but there's a part where Abraham makes a covenant, And if I'm not mistaken, it's a covenant with God. And as he's doing it, it says he cuts this animal in half, and he spreads it a half.
Genesis
Do you know what I'm
17.
talking about?
It's Genesis 17.
Okay, yeah. Do you know about that? Do you want to tie that in any way or comment on that?
Well, there are a lot of penalties in oaths throughout throughout the ancient world at this time. They describe what will be done if you don't keep your oath or your covenant. And a lot of times they do symbolic things with the sacrifices, such as splitting the animal in half. There's an account where they talk about, it's rather gruesome, where they sacrifice the animal and pull out the entrails and say, if I don't keep this agreement, may these entrails be wrapped around my neck and choke me. They could get pretty graphic on how to punish people, but but those sorts of oaths, which are strange to us because we follow Jesus' saying not to make oaths. But those sorts of oaths and covenants were very common in the ancient world, and they even fit in with Nephi swears an oath, and Zoram swears one back, and then they don't worry about each other after they get the golden plates. Those are all fit into that sort of milieu, and it was very much a live one at this time.
Yeah, I think one thing I'll just mention, and then we'll turn over to you, Craig, if you have anything else you'd like to say about these oaths or these gestures, is they do seem very grisly to us today, and they are pretty grisly and pretty graphic. But I think what we need to remember about these oaths that were done anciently in biblical times was they were meant to highlight the absolute seriousness of the oath that you were entering into. And in the Jewish Study Bible that it talks about here. In a footnote to this verse, it mentions the fact that this is indicative of Ruth to Naomi, but also it says it underscores the seriousness of her declaration. So we know that Ruth is serious when she uses this oath and this gesture. But let's move on. That's some interesting insights, and I think maybe we can address some other things. But before we do, Craig, do you have any other comments you'd like to add? Any other insights or anything like that?
Well, a couple of things. One, the swearing an oath, that actually was also common in. You can look back in the Middle Ages. If they swore an oath, it was their honor, their word. And to break that oath, they were considered no longer a man. So it went to the very foundation of who they were. And you can see that being passed on in the early modern age and even being brought over here to America. So it probably did not have, the symbolism and the significance that you get back in Old Testament times, but the concept of swearing an oath, or basically particularly swearing upon your good name, that you find in early American history through the Revolution and the early Republic. If they swore on their good name, then to go contrary to that was the ultimate shame. And we've lost that concept over time. But back, and you look at early Mormon history, and there are several instances where Joseph Smith, where he felt that his name, that his character has been attacked. They could say all kinds of things about him being a false prophet, but if they questioned his character, then he got extremely offended, and that was a holdover from this concept that your name meant everything, and if you swore on your name and then went against that, then you were going against well, like I said, your manhood even, and so is that a hold? Does that come down from Old Testament times? I don't know if it specifically does, but I think that concept of that time period certainly was existent not only in the biblical setting, but in the early Celtic tribes, etc. The concept of swearing an oath, and if you did, then you either lived up to it or you suffered the consequences, which at that time could be your own life. So I just thought I'd throw that out from what I know from early American history.
No, excellent. Thank you for those comments. One last thing I'll mention before we leave the Book of Ruth, and this is just sort of, well, it kind of ties in with Craig's first comment about names and the significance of names, and this is just sort of I keep this in my bag of sort of gee whiz, little factoids that I think are sort of neat or sort of nice. Is in chapter 4, like I mentioned, Boaz comes. It says he comes to the gate of the city and he sat down there, and so he says, now this Redeemer comes, whom Boaz had mentioned, passed by. And so Boaz says to this unnamed Redeemer, he says, come over and sit down here, so and so. I believe the King James has such an one, or Hebrew. It used the name Ploni Almoni, which is actually not a name, but it's kind of a term or an epithet, you might say, that means Mr. So-and-so or Joe Schmo. And one thing that's interesting is Rashi, the medieval Jewish commentator, and some other contemporary commentators talked about the anonymity of this Redeemer who would not take Ruth and fulfill the vow of the levirate. He says the fact that this guy is anonymous, he's given the name Mr. So-and-so, expresses the narrator's disapproval of the man's behavior. So just remember, sometimes names in the Old Testament can signify positive characteristics or positive traits of individuals, or sometimes they can be very unflattering and uncomplimentary of individuals. So, like I said, just sort of a nice, a neat little thing, I believe. But let's now leave the Book of Ruth and finish our discussion for the last couple of minutes in the first chapter of 1 Samuel. And 1 Samuel begins with another woman, the woman Hannah. I'm turning here right now in my scriptures. Here we go. So in 1 Samuel, we begin with Hannah, who is at the tabernacle. She has this husband Elkanah, who has another wife by the name of Peninnah. And Hannah, unfortunately, is barren. She cannot have children. And so she goes to the temple. Oh, and by the way, the other wife, Peninnah, it also says her rival made her miserable and would taunt her that the Lord had closed her womb. So this is a very tender, very sensitive issue, delicate issue for Hannah, the fact that she's childless, and there's another wife who's had children that's now mocking her for it. It's reminiscent of Sarah and Hagar, I believe, in those accounts in Genesis. But what we find out is Hannah goes to the temple, and she's praying to the Lord. And what's interesting is the fact that she's making a covenant with the Lord, and here's the covenant she makes in verse 11. And she made this vow, O Lord of hosts, if you will look upon the suffering of your maidservant, and will remember me, and not forget your maidservant, and if you will grant your maidservant a male child, I will dedicate him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor shall ever touch his head. And so she makes this covenant, this vow to God, and as she's doing it, the priest Eli comes over, and it says he thinks she's drunk because she's praying, well, she's muttering, her lips are moving, but she's not saying anything. So naturally, you assume somebody's drunk when they do that, right? So that's what Eli does. And he gets upset with her, but she explains the situation, and Eli blesses her. Beginning verse 17, then go in peace, said Eli, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. And so we later find out, of course, that she does bear a son. She bears the son Samuel, whom she then dedicates to service in the temple. And this, of course, sets up for our our stories in the book of Samuel, including Eli and his sons, and Samuel, and eventually David and Saul and so forth. So, chapter 1 of 1 Samuel, I think it's wonderful that it begins with the story of a woman, and the focus is on Hannah, the mother of Samuel, and it's significant to me that she's a faithful woman. She knows that she's making this covenant with the Lord and that she'll receive these promised blessings if she's faithful to her covenant. And even when she encounters this awkward situation with Eli, she doesn't lose sight of what her vow is, what her covenant is, and it is eventually fulfilled. And so it's a wonderful beginning to the book of Samuel. And I guess we'll go to, and see if you have any thoughts. Do you have any thoughts or comments for us, John, on this opening chapter of 1 Samuel?
Well, there are some interesting things here. One of them is the way the narrative is put together, and not that this has any sort of doctrinal implications, but we tend not to think about how gifted some of the biblical writers were as writers. So it starts out, it says there's a certain man, and they do something in Hebrew that you can't do in English, because you can have sentences in Hebrew that don't have verbs in them. And it starts out and there aren't any verbs. It says, well, it says there was, and then all of this first, so the first two verses have no verbs. So it's describing, it uses these noun constructions to describe the family situation. And then in verse 3, it starts off with, it uses a verb, but it's talking about a repetitive action. So nothing specific here. They used to go up out of the city every year to worship. And then, so all of this is sort of description, habitual, and then when you finally get verse 4, it says, one day Elkanah was sacrificing, and then it describes the situation there. So it's very artfully constructed in these stages that set the background of the story without, and it's only when the action starts that you really start getting your verbs. And so there's a lot of in this chapter, it's all about Hannah and and sets the background of how she gets a son, and you can tell how grateful she is in 24. When she had weaned him, she took him up with her, with 3 bullocks. Now, for us, we just read that and say, oh yeah, then she took up these sacrifices. Well, she took up more than she needed, and she took up the expensive stuff. So Mary and Joseph, when they come to bring their sacrifices, they offer turtle doves. That's poor people's offerings. A kid is more valuable than turtle doves. A sheep is more valuable than a kid. An ox or something is more valuable than a sheep. And males are more valuable than females, and adults are more valuable than younglings. And so she's bringing up not just 1 bullock, but 3. And so she's bringing up a really, really expensive gift to thank the Lord for this child that she's gotten. It tells you, it's just a little detail that you're going to pass over, but it tells you how much she valued her son. And it's also all the more impressive in the next chapter, or well, at the end of this chapter, is I have lent him to the Lord, and as long as he liveth, he shall be lent to the Lord. So, and we don't hear much about it, but it does say that the text does say in the next chapter that she keeps touch with Samuel as probably as long as she lives, because he lives to be very old. And she views him as God gave him to her, and then she's turning around and giving them back to God.
Excellent comments and insights. Thank you very much. I especially liked your comment about verse 24 and Hannah's very expensive sacrifice and very expensive gift when her son was born, Samuel was born. So those are excellent. And for any of our readers who may be interested, or listeners rather, for any of our listeners who may be interested in learning more about the beauty of biblical narrative and biblical poetry, you can read the books by Robert Alter, The Art of Biblical Poetry and The Art of Biblical Narrative. And he gives an introduction to, as John Gee said, the beauty and the grace of much of biblical poetry. And he pays attention to these sorts of things to really show how wonderful these accounts are from a literary perspective. So there's a recommendation for anyone who's interested is to check those out by Robert Alter.
And he actually uses this very passage as an example of how the stories are laid out. So it's not my insight, it's his.
Yeah, perfect. Oh, perfect. No, it's great though. Excellent. Craig, do you have any thoughts or comments that you'd like to say on 1 Samuel? Anything maybe that John Gee said, or any of you?
I don't. I learned quite a bit there from what John said, but I don't have anything else.
Okay, no worries at all. Just want to make sure that you got a chance to share any of your perspective. So maybe with that, then we can draw this to a close here. I would again recommend listeners to go back and reread these passages. They're very brief. You can read them, relatively quickly. Don't just read over them. Pay attention to these small details, because I'm convinced that the wonderful you read these accounts carefully with an eye for detail, taking time to to appreciate these sorts of small details. I don't know. With that, I guess we can then sign off now. Thank you again for tuning in to our roundtable scripture discussion. I have been your host and moderator, Stephen Smoot, and with me has been John Gee and Craig Foster. And we would encourage you to subscribe to our podcast. This is a weekly podcast or so where we do these roundtables. So subscribe if you haven't already, and if you are a subscriber, then stay alert for upcoming podcasts, for upcoming roundtables as we continue to explore the Old Testament gospel doctrine.